Hello, everyone. I'm Ivo Daalder, president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and this is World Review, our weekly look at news from around the world. And what a week again it was. We'll be looking at Ukraine from all the different aspects. How are we going to increase pressure on the Russians? What is happening in Europe and in particularly in Germany? And how is China reacting to the issues of the day? Are they going to get closer to Russia or going to start using the leverage they have to see if some change is possible? Here to discuss all of this again this week is Nahal Toosi, who is senior foreign affairs reporter for Politico. Nahal, great to have you back. Nahal's in Washington. From Brussels is Jamil Anderlini, who is the editor-in-chief of Politico Europe. Jamil, wonderful to have you on the show for the first time.
Thanks, Ivo.
And from Munich, I believe.
As always.
Stefan Kornelius, who is the political editor of the Süddeutsche Zeitung. Stefan, great to see you as well. Nahal, let's start with you. Debate in Washington is about how can we help the Ukrainians in some ways not only reduce the extraordinary devastation that the Russians are inflicting on the Ukrainians, but also 2+ week in with the reality that only one city really has been taken over by the Russians. Is there more we can do to put pressure on Russia and for Ukraine to find a way for Ukraine to maybe not just have a stalemate, but actually win this war? What is the discussion that you're hearing about, that you're reporting on in Washington, and also what's happening in Europe as we try to get everyone aligned on that course?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. There's a number of things happening. I will say, you're right that to a certain extent, Russia hasn't made that many advances in Ukraine. But at the same time, it seems like they're willing to stay for the long haul. And if that means over time attacking Ukrainian cities, turning them into rubble, we're hearing reports that they're going after cities in Ukraine's west today. It seems like Putin is willing to stick it out the way he did in places like Syria, even if that means extraordinary devastation on the humanitarian front. And we're just there's just so much of that coming. It's terrifying and devastating. And so the question in the United States and in other capitals of NATO countries is how deep do you go in this conflict to help Ukraine without becoming a direct participant in the war? Because that's, for the US in particular, that's kind of a line you don't want to cross. You don't want to have direct conflict with the Russians. You don't want to get NATO dragged into it. As President Biden has said, it's a world war if you do that. The challenge is that there's so much pressure to do more to help Ukraine. Some of it's coming from Ukraine's own president and leadership. They're saying, please give us a no-fly zone. If you're not going to give us a no-fly zone, then give us fighter jets. Then you have members of Congress and others saying, you have to do more, Biden. You have to help them more. And then you have people saying, no, don't give them jets. Don't give them a no-fly zone, because that is inevitably going to lead to a clash with Russia that will drag all of us into this conflict. And so this is, it's a very tricky balance you have to strike, because some of it involves international law, right? So for instance, at what point the level of intelligence the US is sharing, at what point does that become too much to where under international law you're a combatant in this war? Those are some of the things the White House is considering, trying to balance. But it's really tricky, because at the same time, international law doesn't really matter if the people involved decide to ignore it. But what the White House is very aware of is how Putin will react to certain actions. And so when it comes to the fighter jets, we had a situation where the Ukrainians say, give us fighter jets, give us these particular type of fighter jets, MiGs, that our pilots know how to fly. And so there was a situation where Tony Blinken and others for a while said, hey, we're totally fine if Poland or these other countries give these types of fighter jets to Ukraine. The problem is that Poland, for example, doesn't want to be directly handing these over, because it fears that Moscow is going to react to that very badly. The mode of transfer does matter. And especially if there's a situation where Ukrainian pilots fly out of Poland with these jets and engage in clashes with the Russians have already said, if another country, becomes a staging ground for Ukraine, we're going to consider that other country a party to the conflict. So Poland announces that, hey, we're happy to give these jets to the United States and the US can transfer them to Ukraine. And that's when things really went crazy, because there was clearly divisions within the Biden administration, the intelligence community, the Defense Department. They were saying, we don't think we should give these jets at all. This could be an escalation that could turn into something really ugly with Russia. So for now, that plan appears to be on hold. And it's a real blow to the Ukrainians, who really feel like that is something that they need if the U.S. and other NATO countries can't help them establish a no-fly zone. So those are some of the things that are being considered, and it's very, very tricky. And at the end of the day, it kind of comes down to what Vladimir Putin decides is crossing the line for him.
Yeah, Nahal, that's a great overview, I think, of this real dilemma of how far to the line. Where is the line, and how far can you get to that line? And Stefan, I wonder, that's the debate in Washington. It's very much about where the line and how far can you get it. And tell us a little bit about what's happening in Germany and Europe more generally on that issue, because what's absent in many ways in the U.S. debate is, well, is there another line? Is there a de-escalation? Is there something we can do to incentivize a negotiation and an exit? That's not where the discussion is in Washington. I wonder if that's beginning to be a discussion in Germany in particular. But also more generally, and how this balance is being struck in the debate over there.
Well, I do see extremely conflicting messages. On the one side, you have a very agitated public which wants this war to end in favor of the Ukrainians. There is no room at all for compromise with Putin. The way he acts, the way he conducts this war, the way he sort of inflicts or sort of includes us in his thinking of, well, almost totalitarian dimensions, forbids us to basically compromise at all. And we have seen the first attempts of diplomatic exchange this week in Antalya, where the Russian foreign minister and Ukrainian foreign minister basically had nothing to say to each other, and those demands which were exchanged there are simply not reconcilable. I think the debate very quickly switches over into another extreme, which is, if Putin is so hard-nosed, if he's so really deep into it, if he's had decided to go to the extreme here on this, is there a way we can offer him a path out of it? How can Putin lose without recognizing that he will lose? Or put it the other way around, as one extremely high-rank source from Moscow told me this week, Putin never lost. He never lost anything. He never lost a war. He never was defeated. We don't know how he does react if he is defeated. So that's the big fear. Are we obliged basically to think in his sort of terminology, in his way of thinking of ending this conflict? Honestly, my fantasy is not big enough to find ways right now, but at least these thoughts are being exchanged. They're being debated. I think there was, especially now in the European leaders meeting this week in Versailles, thoughts about it. I do read it also from the Washington side or from the US side, that there's talk about it. And that's basically an absurd situation. It's an extremely puzzling moment that we do have to think the extreme, that Putin losing would be a bigger danger to us than Putin at least winning partly in this war.
Jamil, I think Stefan has it, right in this dilemma, because of the worry of escalation. He does have the capacity both to escalate in terms of, which it seems he's already doing in Ukraine, in terms of the scale of the attacks on civilians. He could escalate geographically by involving other parts. He's pretty close to Moldova as one instance, for example. And of course, there's NATO territory on his borders that could be a threat. And he could escalate with the weapons that he uses. He's already threatened a nuclear possibility, and the U.S. intelligence community warning about chemical and biological false flag stories and the possibility that may happen. When you listen to folks in Brussels and the European Union, how are they balancing the escalation, the off ramp, the line beyond which we don't want to go? How is that discussion going in as far as you can see in the capital of Europe?
Yeah, as you know very well, Ivo, the discussion's always different in the different capitals around Europe, and but the thing that long-time EU watchers are telling me is what's astonishing this time is the unity that you actually are hearing amongst the Europeans and in the transatlantic relationship. So we've written a couple of times about how Putin has done the impossible and unified Europe and solidified the transatlantic relationship. We're also hearing about scenario planning, as you can imagine. And there are sort of 4 scenarios that are kind of crystallizing. One is World War III, pretty bad for everyone, I think. Number 2, a coup and Putin gets killed by his own people, pretty bad for Putin. 3, some sort of face-saving thing where he declares victory and pulls back to the Donbass with a land corridor to Crimea, and he says, mission accomplished. That's kind of in some ways, probably the most likely. And the 4th, I guess, is some sort of negotiated settlement where something comes out of it, where that's the least clear, I'd say, of all of them. So we're hearing people discuss different scenarios, and that's where I think we're mostly at the moment here in Europe. But as I say, unity of purpose, unity like we haven't seen, maybe ever in amongst countries. And if you look at the press conferences, if you look at Macron is standing up and he's got Charles Michel and Ursula von der Leyen. I mean, when Antony Blinken comes here to talk to the Europeans, when he calls Europe, he's actually, it's raising the profile and raising the credibility and the standing of the leaders of the European Union in a way that we haven't really seen probably ever since these positions were created.
I mean, that's clearly one of the things that is happening is there is this unity. The question is, I guess, Nahal, how can that unity be used to affect a change in behavior, particularly of Vladimir Putin? And one of the big steps that talking about the impossible now becoming possible that was just taken this week was, of course, the Russian oil import ban, combined with a European serious discussion about how to rapidly reduce energy imports from Russia through a transition. How is that playing out? And by the way, how long can that be sustained as prices and production problems emerge because of that?
Yeah, well, politics are never too far behind policy, especially in Washington. And you're already seeing Republicans and others blame Joe Biden for rising gas prices. And the White House has responded by calling them Putin's price hikes. But yeah, this is the type of thing that even in the US, where there is a lot of, much less reliance on Russian oil, this nonetheless is a fear factor for people. And so I know that in Europe, it's an even bigger issue. So I just think this idea of unity, I guess I'm a little more pessimistic than some others. I think it seems like there's a lot of unity now on certain fronts, but over time, the longer this goes, the more you're going to have people who want to accommodate to some extent for energy and other reasons. But, I just think it's in the long run, I don't think this unity is going to hold between the US and its European allies.
Well, it's a good transition, Stefan, to you, because in some ways, thinking about what has happened in the last 2 weeks in Germany, the country that you are in, Germany, in some ways being about as key to European unity and perhaps even to transatlantic unity as any other country. Talk a little bit about the change of mood and its durability and longevity, and the capacity then of Germany to use that change of mood to really mobilize in a way that, lots of us have written about for decades, wanting a German, Franco-German, whatever, but some motor that really bring this about. And there is this question: how long can it last, and is it real? And if so, is it going to be able to galvanize Europe in the kind of ways we're seeing in the last couple of weeks for the next few months, and indeed for the next few years, if we're going to be in this conflict for that long?
Well, I actually would have never taken a bet a couple of months ago that I would see these changes happening in my lifetime, but we were preaching them for years and decades. But honestly, the mood swings and the political swings are pretty extreme, and that kind of extremism is also a bit worrying, and you wonder how sustainable it is. Let me sort of compartmentalize it in two things. First, on the energy front, I think this is the much bigger change. The German lifelong dependency on Russian gas and oil survived the Cold War. It survived basically everything. We were basically battling Nord Stream 2 a couple of weeks ago as it would have been the future of the transatlantic alliance, and now it's gone. The debate now in this country is whether how quickly we can sustain without Russian energy supply. This is by our 40% supply rate of gas for our energy mix. So this is fierce, and we're talking about an amount which is comparable to most other countries in Europe and definitely the US. Probably just topped by the Italian dependency and probably Austrian dependency, which is even worse. So Germany's industry capacity, its labor market, its growth, its everything pretty much depends on the question whether energy supply is guaranteed. And we're not talking about the spring or summer, we're talking about next winter. And I think the government is making incredible efforts to change that. Not within months or years, but within weeks. They do have task forces out there, travel the world, opening new markets, preparing to pay higher prices, trying to get the mix right this time. All those emergency measures had been in the drawers for years, actually. They had never been used. The Merkel government never made cashed in on those promises they always had, mostly for the Social Democrats, which were prohibiting them. The Social Democrats' intimacy, dependency on this Russian link goes back not only to Gerhard Schröder, but even further back. So we're talking about really substantial historical changes here. On the military side, it's even more breathtaking. And but this is also the part where the rubber has to hit the road first before we can see whether there comes something out of it or whether there's speed behind it. The military machine in Germany, the apparatus there, the procurement, especially the procurement sector, also the industrial side behind it. This is so in rubbles. It's basically non-functioning that you have to build it from scratch. And if you spend 100 billion basically out of the coffers just immediately and throw all this cash around you, it can go badly wrong. So I wonder whether this is well thought through. It was an immediate political reaction, and it had this tremendous effect. First, to take all the pressure away from Germany. B, to rally most Central European countries behind the Scholz government. So they cut their alignment to Angela Merkel and shredded all the distrust in the social democratic-led government of Scholz. And now he basically easily bypassed Macron as being the one who's more credible in taking the lead for Europe in these new challenges. We have to see how this materializes, whether there's really something substantive to it, but the initial direction seems to be right.
Just on the defense euros that people are talking about, the point you make, one about how extraordinary it is in terms of the switch from the debate we've had over the past couple of decades in terms of the magnitude, but also this really big, important issue that I think we need to pay attention to. You don't spend 100 billion euros really easily and effectively and translate it into real capabilities. And I hope that organizations like NATO and frankly, the United States are helping to helping to think through, plan for, and procure in the right kind of way. Jamil, it strikes me, and I think Stefan already noted, if the East Europeans are aligning behind the Scholz government, that is a pretty darn big change from where we have. And I do wonder, when you look at the unity that exists today, whether that glue is really being cemented. Is that the wrong mixed metaphors here? But whether Germany really can play that leadership role in very close concert with, of course, the leadership in the European Union itself, which I think we're pretty fortunate to have two people at the moment leading that who seem to be up to the task. Certainly, Ursula von der Leyen is playing that role extremely well. How do you see, is this the change that is going to be lasting, and then having Germany as part of that?
So who would have thought we'd be wishing for German militarism again? But here we are. That's just what we need. So what's been fascinating for me, as you know, Ivo, I only arrived here in Europe after 21 years in China, in Asia. I arrived here last October, and the story for the first 4 or 5 months was these terrible splits in the European Union, with Poland getting more and more, Hungary, Poland, other countries in that part of Europe getting more and more authoritarian, drifting close to Putin in many cases. And that's also been completely astonishing for me, is that's the sudden turnaround. Now, Poland are the good guys. Hungary's, Orban is a defender of freedom and democracy against Russian aggression. The speed at which the narrative is switched is just mind-blowing, really. And so it's all part of, as I say, this is what Putin has done, and overnight he's taken the baddies and made them look really good. People who were, there were threats about kicking Poland and Hungary out of the European Union. Should they even be part of the European Union? Now it's like NATO solidarity. And I just think, we're going to be picking over the changes that have happened in a couple of weeks. We're going to be picking over these for years and saying, look at what happened in that very, very short period of time. I can't remember who said it, but it's, history, there are periods, Lenin, I think, there are periods of when, decades happen in weeks. And it's true. That's what's, as someone who's a very new student of Europe and the European Union and the European story, it's just been absolutely mind-boggling. I have to say, when I told everyone I knew back in the Asia watching community, I'm moving to Europe, it's, they're all like, oh my God, how could you do that? It's going to be so boring. Asia and China is where it's at, and you're leaving that for like the most boring story in the world. And I'm just like calling them now like, hey, check it out. Not in a good way. Obviously it's horrific, and I'm not trying to make light or be facetious, but as a journalist and as a student of history and a student, as a journalist writing the first draft of history, just an amazing time to be here. Very distressing in some ways. I thought in some ways I was getting away from some of the horrors, but anyway, sorry, Harley.
Can I add one thought, Jamil? Because I think you put a really good sort of, you're thumping one of those hot issues, societal issues. We're talking about now policy decisions and money spending and all that, but we do see major societal shifts in attitude towards Russia, towards the question of deterrence, self-defense, preparedness. Yes, call it militarization. And that's not quite new, especially to a German audience. And this is what makes me a little bit worrisome, that those mood swings are extremely harsh, and they don't seem to be sort of subsidized and substantially sort of funded somewhere. So we really need to watch that carefully and need to avoid some kind of overreaching, which definitely I do detect in our desire to react harshly towards Putin.
And I would just add that, it's also worth noting that the geopolitical reverberations are going well beyond Europe. I mean, and sometimes in ways that kind of expose the hypocrisy of the United States and some of its allies. We heard that the U.S. is talking to Venezuelan dictator Nicolás Maduro about, reestablishing relations with him, and because we believe that we might need his oil because of the loss of Russian oil from the market. And this is literally a kleptocratic dictator, oil-rich guy that the U.S. has been trying to weaken for more than 2 years. And now, as we're going after another kleptocratic, oil-rich dictator, we're turning to the other guy. It's just this bizarre situation, and not to mention the oil-rich non-democracies in the Middle East. And so it's just worth noting that for all the talk of, oh, this is democracy against autocracy, and where Putin is like the evil guy that is doing something to a democratic nation, the policies of the United States nonetheless still reflect to a certain degree our reliance on dictatorships.
I think it's a very valid point, and to Stefan's point also of the worry about what you're wishing for, and it's not just in the German rearmament case, but just more generally. I think what we've seen this sea change, but I don't think we've had a conceptual lens put onto it yet that allows us to think about this in a steady and integrated and forward-looking way. I think we've had an immediate reaction, and it's an extraordinary reaction that is very welcome given where we used to be. I think we have woken up to the reality that in some ways history never left, but it's certainly back. And that the kind of ways we're looking at these issues for at least the last 3 decades, but in some ways in the post-Cold War period, this Bob Kagan post-war period, as Bob Kagan said, the jungle's growing back, also meaning that there used to be a jungle, just was cleared for a while. And how do we act in that environment in a way that holds true to our values, maintains the unity of the contestants in the fight, and frankly makes the right choices with regard to that? Jamil, jump in.
Yeah, I was just picking up on what both Stefan and Hallie have said. When I first arrived here in October, I read a classic book, Pulitzer Prize winner by Barbara Tuchman, The Guns of August. And to your point about how these things can spin out of, I mean, it's always twee to make these sort of historical comparisons. But if you look at, the first scenario that people are planning for, potentially World War III, you could easily see how this could, okay, Poland gives some MiGs directly to Ukraine, Russia invades Poland. Like nobody thought that Germany was going to go through Belgium in World War I, right? In 1914. Nobody thought Germany would be so crazy as to pull the Britain into the war by violating Belgian neutrality. And I have to say, most people in this town were like, at the most, he'll take the Donbass, but he's violated Belgian neutrality. That's what he's sort of done with this invasion. It's again, we don't want to make too many historical comparisons, but if you're looking for one, World War I is not, it's not crazy to look at the similarities.
No, and I think, yeah, go ahead now.
It's just, you guys are like better, versed in this stuff than I am, but why do people not think of the worst case scenario or believe it can happen? Like, this is driving me crazy. Why did anybody not think that Putin would do this? Like, to me, it was pretty obvious from the beginning. Like, I just, can you explain to me, like, when it comes to like international relations, what is the deal with people like not preparing for and believing the worst possible scenario? Because to me, that seems like the only thing you should do. Sorry.
I mean, I tell you, this kind of thinking has totally disappeared from the European minds. And Ivo just wrote a great piece on deterrence, on sort of the old Cold War thinking. And this is basically what we hang on to now. We take those old mechanisms of deterrence, of nuclear strategy back from the files and try to learn from it and adapt it to the 21st century. But the immediate step is to get back that in that thinking that the most evil thoughts have to be thought. And this has disappeared from European minds. It's definitely from German minds. We thought we live in the eternal peace dividend, and it's wrong. It was definitely wrong.
I mean, if I was running the world right now, and we want to talk about China, but this is, look, I mean, why? I hope we are prepared for the Chinese going after Taiwan in the next 2 months. I just, because if we're not doing our jobs, and I just. So anyway, I hope that gives you the transition. I mean, I think
I think you're. I think the point is well taken, but there's the reality of what the intelligence community and military planners do, and in this case, the intelligence community knew exactly what was going to happen. They got it exactly right. They then made the decision to actually publicize it, first to allies, then publicly, and yet I think even people who had seen all the intelligence didn't believe it. And the psychology of having to, we have had what's extraordinary is not that this is happening. What's extraordinary, how long it didn't happen in a great historical context. But it also means that if you've lived in relative peace and worried about things that are not war and peace, or I guess it's now called special military operations and peace. That's just, and it's true in Europe, and it's true in many ways in the United States. And I think we need a new way of thinking. Jamil, I think Nahal already opened up the next our next final conversation, which is on China, because of course the Chinese don't think in those terms. They it seems to me, are very ready for the competition. They have been building up militarily for quite a while, and I help us think through how China is looking at this situation. Where does Xi Jinping, who was hoping for a quiet year so he could quietly be reelected,
selected, not elected, selected.
Selected, yes.
Reselected by heaven.
By the higher authorities, which he controls. But he was hoping for that. Where does he find himself at this moment? And were they caught unawares? Did they know what was coming and they're ready for it? Or how should we look at it? You know this place and thought about this more than anyone else I know. Help us understand.
Yeah, so to give you the context, I'm not talking to people in Beijing. They can't, my old contacts, my old sources, I can't talk to them anymore, really. My 20 years in China was spent, the first 10, I would say, were a period of opening and flowering and everything getting better and more international, more open. And the last decade was everything tightening, the new era of Xi Jinping, more and more totalitarian, to the point where now I would definitely categorize China as a totalitarian dictatorship, with Xi Jinping hoping to be emperor for life. And as you say, end of this year, he's supposed to put the stamp on it and break all traditions under in the post-Mao era. Everything since the mid-70s, he's ripped it all up, and now he wants to rule for life like a Mao Zedong dictator. So now, when it comes to this, obviously, Putin was there in Beijing for the Winter Olympics. It was all no limits, is the way that the two sides described their relationship. I have to say, I personally believe that China got played. Xi Jinping personally got played. That Putin probably said, well, I'm going to do some limited special military operation. He wouldn't have gone more than that. I mean, that's how he would have maybe described it. The Chinese would have said, fine, do your special limited military operation, but wait until after the Olympics. That's what we're hearing from different, American sources mostly. I suspect the Chinese thought it was going to be a very small thing. They were going to go and maybe take it, like people in Europe, take a bit of the Donbass, maybe a little more, and China would say, fine, and it's done. It'll be a cakewalk and it's all over. I don't think the Chinese had any conception that he was going to go after Kiev and take the whole thing, swallow the whole thing. And it causes them some very serious problems, actually. First of all, they don't want to be cut out of the global financial system. They are very, China in general is very vulnerable to trade embargoes. It's a very still trade reliant economy. Domestically, the real estate market, which is the other sort of big prop in the Chinese economic so-called miracle, is doing extremely badly. They have got a lot of internal domestic economic problems, and if they were to start facing serious trade embargoes, they would be in trouble. And remember, they're not selling oil and gas; they're selling toasters and iPhones, and you can get that for a little bit more money from a lot of other places, actually. So I think that this whole thing is causing China massive problems, and Xi Jinping personally lots of problems, because all of the indications are that he was the one driving this relationship. I have to say, I wrote a column in 2017 saying that just like the Western intelligence agencies missed the Sino-Soviet split in the late 50s, early 60s, I felt back in 2017 that the West was missing the Sino-Soviet rapprochement and really, them drawing closer and closer together. Drawing closer together, not because they love each other, they actually mostly don't like each other very much, China and Russia, but Xi and Putin in particular were drawn together by this anti-democratic, anti-Western, and anti-American, in particular, anti-American animus, and this idea of the great rejuvenation of these great nations, great civilizations, which have been put upon by evil Western democracies, and now it's time to fight back. And that's the main thing that's drawn them close together. And it's scary. And I think, I like you, Hallie, I worry about, deeply worry about Taiwan. I got a lot of friends in Taiwan, I got a lot of friends in China, and I worry desperately about a war. What I would say, though, is if you think that Russia's army has, maybe not fared so well in a land war, imagine like trying to cross the Taiwan Straits. The Chinese military, deeply corrupt as it is, still very behind in many, many ways, actually seriously reliant on, Western chip technology. Do you really, if Russia's had a hard time of it, I think China, watching this very closely, will think twice about trying an amphibious attack across the Taiwan Straits.
If I could jump in,
Yep.
I think that's all very, very helpful, and I totally see where you're coming from. A couple of points. So, again, it's not just about traditional warfare, right? I mean, look at what China did to Hong Kong. That was basically an invasion, and it's part of China. So I was there through the whole time. I understand, but I mean, it's we have to think about it that way as well. We have to also think about the way that China has been trying to get positions, in multilateral organizations around the world, and how that's going to affect the way that the world can react to Russia, much less anything that China does in the future. For instance, the Chinese have, top roles at the Food and Agriculture Organization. And, there's concerns now about whether they're going to allow changes to policy that are necessary for places that rely a lot on wheat and other products from Russia. These are the types of things that it's really like everybody has to really consider when thinking, how will China react to Russia? It's not a narrow thing. It's a very multi-factor place where they have a lot of different levers that they can pull. And to be really frank, they don't have to do things perfectly. They can just cause chaos, right? And that in and of itself does a lot of damage. Now you say, look, they are reliant on the economy as well, and the global economy, and they need stability to a certain degree as well. And I don't disagree with that, but I also have to wonder if, they're watching what Putin is doing and aren't learning other things, like maybe we can push the limit, and maybe what we just need to do is make sure our economy is way more sanctions proof than Putin's ever was. They are learning lessons from this, and I will, again, one other thing, and I know this is, again, one of those like psychosocial things that invades my mind now and then, is like, I still can't, I don't understand how, one guy, like whether it's Xi or Putin, manages to like climb these structures and hollow them out and make them loyal to himself, especially even in a system like China, where you thought there was a more institutional type of element to it. And yet one guy can get up there and just, I don't know, sorry, maybe I should discuss these things with like a therapist or something. But I just wish someone could explain to me how one dude, like I can't even convince my friends to like go to the place I want to go for dinner, you know, but yet like these guys like manage to like.
You've got to arrest their parents or their children and then they will go to dinner with you. That's how he did it. I mean, it's really, we can talk about it forever.
How do you convince the people to like go arrest these people?
People don't have a choice. No.
I need a better explanation for this.
It's all about fear and repression. Stefan, you know, this was the issue in which Europe and the United States were really on opposite sides for so long. China, whether or not to engage or not, you know, just before Biden's inauguration, Europe signed an investment and trade agreement with China. Merkel leading the charge. So I think that the big question is, how has the gestalt shift on Putin, the change with regard to Russia, affected European perceptions of China? Is there a rapid change coming in that way as well? Of course, it's not military in the first instance, but in terms of economic dependence, about how to think about this in the world, is this a more geopolitical shift writ large, or is it just focused on Russia?
Well, I think it will serve as a wake-up call towards China as well. It hasn't really obsessed public minds, but definitely in the political classes in Berlin, that's what I know for sure. There's now major thinking going on how to disentangle strategically from China. I'm even talking about goods and services where we are depending on in a way we shouldn't. So all those, I mentioned earlier, those lists being prepared on strategic assets which we should rebuild, bring back to Europe. These lists are now brought back and they're now seriously considered. So basically what's happening in Europe is also in reverse serving as a wake-up call for China, or as a warning for China, and the kind of unity Europe can perform. We saw the pins and needles tactics versus Lithuania over the past months and weeks, and the sanctions regime, which is now designed by the European Union, actually starting last October, is pretty much modeled after the American model, and in terms of its legal outreach, can be easily adopted towards China. So it's the first time that Europe has adopted that kind of sanction mechanism, which should serve as a warning also to China. Now, I think hope is, and that's the prevailing public sentiment, that China would take the side of the good guys, and influence Russia in a positive way.
I think they are taking the side of the good guys. They think Russia's the good guys. That's the
exactly,
problem.
And that's exactly sort of the signal we're now waiting for. The kind of sitting on the fence attitude she is showing right now will come to an end. Basically, China is forced to take sides. You cannot abstain from this. If you want to be a world power and China wants to be a world power, you can't be quiet. And China is not quiet. And Jamil talked about it. I mean, we know where they're leaning to, and they just have to say it more publicly and openly, and then the war is on. And then we have to make sides. So what we're watching now, or probably watching, is the beginning of a huge disentanglement in globalization. We are seeing a new bipolarization in the world between the authoritarian, non-democratic regimes and the others. And so welcome back to the Cold War, just under different circumstances. We're talking ideology again, but not communism, but totalitarianism.
Unfortunately, I mean, from the perspective of free societies, this time around, China's economy is, much stronger, certainly than it was before, and probably much stronger than the Soviet Union's ever really was as well. I would argue, having, as I said, covered it for 20 years there, it's weaker than it appears from the outside. And I think what we'll see in the next few years is some of those weaknesses emerge much more clearly, but we'll have to see. But I tend to agree with you, Stefan. I think it's the new Cold War, and it's actually started a while ago, and now it's more than cold. It's a bit hot in places.
Yeah.
Can we come up with a new label? Like you guys know how much I like detest like old labels. Like it's not. Let's come up with something different beyond Cold War.
So you're sorry, Stefan, you said
very cold war, frozen war,
frozen war. Yeah. I mean, I just one other data point. I think to put to cross the T's and I's. It's pretty remarkable how Japan, Australia, and South Korea have dealt with this crisis either. I mean, the Japanese are opening up their doors to Ukrainian refugees. That is totally new. You have military and other assistance being provided to Ukraine. And I do think you have this emergence, in part because they're living next to China and understand it. And by the way, with a new Korean government, more conservative, more pro-American, and more anti-China, I think you're seeing this realignment that is across North America, Europe, and Asia that is very much focused on not just Russia but also on China. And the real question is do the Chinese understand that what Xi Jinping needs may not be what's good for China? Because the leverage they could exert on Russia is extraordinary, and the benefit they could derive from that doing so by presumably, again, dividing the West would be significant. But I fear that particularly leaders who get to the top through brutality and repression are least likely to change course. So for the very reasons they succeed and where they are, it's also the ones where they dig their own graves. At least the question always is, what's the damage between now and that point that we're facing? I want to thank Nahal Toosi, Jamil Anderlini, and Stefan Kornelius for really an excellent conversation. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll be back next week with another edition of World Review. And until then, bye-bye and have a great weekend.
Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot.